The rooftop bar hung suspended above Seattle like a promise of something better, something earned through ambition and carefully cultivated success. Golden hour light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, transforming ordinary glass into liquid amber, catching the rims of wine glasses and painting long shadows across the polished marble table, where four people sat in the comfortable arrogance of those who had never truly been tested. Below them, the city sprawled in all its indifferent glory. Skyscrapers pierced the horizon like declarations of wealth and power. Traffic moved in silent streams of red and white light. People went about their lives unaware they were being looked down upon, both literally and figuratively, by those who had decided they mattered more. Bridger Castellano occupied his chair the way successful men often do, with casual ownership, one arm draped over the backrest, as if even furniture existed primarily to accommodate him. His navy blazer probably cost what most people earned in a month, and the fabric held that particular quality of expensive things simultaneously understated and impossible to ignore. His smile carried the hollow warmth of someone who had perfected the art of appearing genuine while feeling nothing, a skill that had served him well in real estate where sincerity was currency and authenticity was just another word for weakness. Across from him, Sloane Devereaux held her phone like a weapon of self-documentation, angling it with practiced precision to capture the sunset behind her. 3 photos in rapid succession, each one calculated to appear effortlessly beautiful, the kind of spontaneous perfection that actually required meticulous planning. Her entire existence was curated for consumption, every experience filtered through the lens of how it would appear to an audience that existed only in digital form, followers who knew her face but would never know her at all. Paxton Reeves sat with the particular stillness of corporate attorneys, those who had learned to view every conversation as a negotiation to be won. His charcoal suit announced his profession before he spoke, and his eyes carried that sharp quality of constant assessment, always calculating angles and advantages. He swirled his whiskey with deliberate slowness, watching the ice shift as if even his drink required strategic consideration. Lennox Foss completed the quartet, younger, but perhaps most dangerous, lean and sharp-featured, with the restless energy of someone whose tech startup had exploded into success before he'd learned humility. He checked his watch constantly, not because he had somewhere to be, but because his entire identity was constructed around the belief that time was currency and he was wealthy beyond measure. Every glance at his wrist was a small reminder to himself and everyone around him of just how valuable his presence was supposed to be. They had been meeting like this for months now, planning the Glen Ridge Academy class of 2015 reunion with an enthusiasm that revealed their arrested development. People who had truly moved on didn't spend this much time recreating high school hierarchies. But for Bridger, Sloane, Paxton, and Lennox, those 4 years had been their golden age, the time when their place in the world had felt certain and secure, when they had been kings and queens of a small kingdom that had never prepared them for the reality that outside those walls, nobody cared about their carefully constructed throne. Bridger stopped scrolling on his tablet, and something in his expression shifted. A predatory smile spread slowly across his face like oil on water, the kind of smile that meant someone was about to become entertainment, a punchline, a story they would tell each other to feel better about themselves. He turned the screen toward the others with deliberate movements, building the moment. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of malicious inspiration that had been perfected in high school always and never quite abandoned. "What about Sierra Vale?" Sloane glanced up from her phone, squinting at the screen, before recognition hit her with visible force. Her eyes widened, and laughter burst from her throat, too loud for the elegant space around them, drawing annoyed glances from nearby tables that she didn't notice or care about. "Oh my God," she gasped between fits of laughter. "Sierra Vale. I completely forgot she even existed." Paxton leaned forward, studying the yearbook photo on the tablet with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and contempt, as if he couldn't quite process that someone like this had been allowed to exist in the same space as people like them. The girl who ate lunch alone in the art room every single day. He asked, his voice carrying that mocking tone that had once made him popular and now just made him cruel. "Are you actually serious?" Lennox grinned, his eyes lighting up with the kind of cruel brilliance that characterized people who had learned early that other people's pain could be transformed into social capital. "This is absolutely perfect," he said, tapping his knuckles on the table with emphasis. "We send her an invitation. She shows up thinking people actually want to see her, that maybe things have changed, that maybe she matters now. Sloane picked up the thread immediately, her laughter transforming into something sharper, more calculated, the wheels turning behind her carefully made up face. And we get to remind everyone exactly how far we've all come, she said, pausing to find the perfect phrase, the one that would make this moment feel justified rather than what it actually was. The contrast alone would be chef's kiss. Bridger was already typing, adding Sierra's name to the digital guest list, with theatrical flair, narrating aloud as if announcing something important rather than cruel. Invitation to the Glen Ridge Academy class of 2015 reunion. He read, his voice carrying false formality. At the Cascadia Grand Estate. Black tie required. He looked up, grinning with anticipation. She'll show up in something from a thrift store. Guaranteed. Paxton smirked, lifting his whiskey glass in a mock toast. If she even shows up at all. People like that usually know better than to actually accept. Sloane raised her own glass with absolute certainty, the kind of confidence that came from years of being right about which people mattered and which didn't. Oh, she'll show up, she said quietly, and there was something almost sad in her voice, a recognition of a universal truth she had witnessed too many times. People like Sierra always show up. They always hope things have changed. They never learn. They clinked their glasses together, the sound sharp and bright in the expensive air around them, sealing their pact with casual cruelty, four people who had learned that the world rewarded this kind of behavior more often than it punished it. Bridger tapped the final button with a flourish, and a notification appeared on the screen. Invitation delivered. The camera lingered on the tablet, slowly zooming in on the yearbook photo that had sparked all this. The girl in the image looked fragile, almost ghostly, with oversized glasses that dominated her pale face, and thin hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that seemed designed to make her disappear rather than stand out. She wore a sweater that swallowed her small frame several sizes too large, as if she was trying to hide inside it. But her eyes held something unsettling, something that didn't match the fragility of the rest of her. They stared directly forward with an intensity that seemed to look not at the photographer, but through him into something farther away that only she could see. There was determination there, hidden beneath the surface, a quality that none of them had noticed 10 years ago, and wouldn't have understood if they had. The memories appeared in fragments, quick cuts of cruelty that felt less like nostalgia and more like evidence in a trial that would never happen, proof of systematic destruction that had been normalized, accepted, even encouraged. The cafeteria came first, that universal theater of high school hierarchy, where social standing was established and maintained through carefully choreographed performances of inclusion and exclusion. Sierra sat alone in the corner, her back pressed against the wall, as if she could disappear into it, become part of the architecture rather than a target. A thick textbook lay open before her, the title reading, Flight Dynamics in Aeronautical Engineering, marking her as different, as someone whose aspirations existed beyond the immediate currency of teenage social acceptance, someone who was already looking toward the horizon that none of them could see. Around her, tables erupted with laughter and chaos, the normal noise of hundreds of teenagers concentrated in one space. But none of it touched her. She had learned early that invisibility was safer than visibility, that being noticed meant being heard, and so she had perfected the art of existing without being seen. She turned pages with methodical focus, her expression never changing and her concentration absolute, as if the words on those pages were a lifeline to somewhere else, somewhere better. The next memory cut in sharper, more violent. Her locker stood vandalized, the word ghost spray-painted across the metal in thick, dripping letters. The paint was still wet, running down in uneven streaks that looked like wounds, like the locker itself was bleeding from the cruelty. The smell of aerosol hung in the air, sharp and chemical. Sierra stood before it, staring at the word with an expression that revealed nothing. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction, because she had learned that reactions were what they wanted, that her pain was their entertainment, and she would not perform for them. She simply opened the locker, the hinges creaking, retrieved her books with careful deliberation, and walked away with steady composure, her spine straight, her step measured. Behind her, students watched and laughed, Sloane among them, whispering something that made the others double over with cruel amusement, their faces twisted with the particular ugliness that comes when cruelty is disguised as humor. A classroom appeared next, the familiar ritual of tests being returned, that moment of judgment, when performance was quantified and ranked, when your value was reduced to a number written in red ink. The teacher moved down the rows with practiced efficiency, and when she reached Sierra, she smiled with genuine approval and set the paper down with a nod of recognition. Sierra turned it over carefully. 98% written in red ink at the top, circled twice. Behind her, Bridger received his paper with less ceremony. 72%. His jaw tightened as he glimpsed Sierra's score over her shoulder, and something dark flashed across his face, the particular anger of someone who had been told his whole life he was special, discovering that someone he considered beneath him was actually better. He crumpled the paper into a ball with deliberate force and threw it at the back of Sierra's head. It bounced off, falling to the floor with a hollow sound. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge it, simply folded her test with precision as if it were something precious and fragile, and placed it carefully in her binder, continuing forward as if he didn't exist at all. That non-reaction enraged him more than any response could have. The most painful fragment came last, cutting deeper than the others, because it revealed not just cruelty, but also hope, the dangerous hope that had kept Sierra going when everything else told her to give up. Career day in the gymnasium, rows of booths representing different futures, different possibilities. Students wandered between them with varying levels of interest, most treating it as an excuse to skip class, a joke, something to endure rather than engage with. In the far corner stood a booth with a banner reading U.S. Navy Recruitment. Behind the table sat an officer in dress whites, his uniform crisp and perfect, his posture military straight. His chest carried ribbons that spoke of service and sacrifice, of things these teenagers couldn't begin to understand. Only one person stood at his booth. Sierra leaned forward, asking a question. The camera couldn't capture her body language, intense, focused. The officer studied her for a moment, perhaps surprised by her genuine interest, then reached into his folder and handed her a pamphlet, which she accepted with both hands carefully, as if it were precious and fragile, a lifeline to something better. "What does it take to fly an Apache?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. The officer regarded her with professional assessment, perhaps seeing something in her intensity that others had missed. "Dedication," he said, "courage, and the willingness to refuse to quit when everything tells you to." Sierra nodded, absorbing his words like they were scripture. Her hand trembled slightly as she took the pamphlet, but her voice remained steady. "I will do this," she said, and it wasn't a question or a hope, it was a vow. "I swear it." The officer's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Then I'll see you in the fleet, young lady." Across the gymnasium, students had noticed the exchange. They pointed and erupted in mocking laughter, one of them performing an exaggerated salute that sent the others into hysterics. Bridger led the mockery, his voice carrying across the space. "Sierra's going to be a pilot," he shouted, laughing. "Yeah, good luck with that ghost girl." The laughter rolled through the crowd like a wave, but Sierra didn't look at them. She simply thanked the officer with quiet dignity, tucked the pamphlet into her bag with reverent care, and walked away, her head up, her steps measured, walking towards something they couldn't see and wouldn't have understood if they could. The final image was graduation day, and it hit with the weight of accumulated loneliness. The building stood imposing against a blue sky, red brick and white columns, the kind of architecture meant to inspire respect and nostalgia. Students poured out in caps and gowns, surrounded by proud families, friends embracing with tears and laughter, parents crying with joy, the whole messy celebration of an ending that was also a beginning. Sierra walked out alone. No family, no friends. She wore her cap and gown like everyone else, but there was no one to document the moment, no one to mark this passage with photograph or embraces. She paused at the bottom of the steps, turning back to look at the building one final time, and her expression was unreadable, something complex passing across her face that might have been pain or determination or both. Then she turned and walked away down the long sidewalk that stretched into the afternoon, her figure growing smaller, with each step shrinking into the distance until she was just a tiny silhouette, disappearing into light alone, heading towards something none of them could imagine. A voice drifted over the image, soft and detached, carrying the weight of understanding that comes only with distance and time. They wrote her off as nothing, a dreamer, a nobody destined for disappointment and obscurity. They called her Ghost because she was invisible, because she didn't matter, because she was easy to forget. The image faded slowly to black. They should have known. Ghosts can't be killed. They can only return. The present day arrived with the harsh fluorescence of military lighting and the smell of jet fuel that never quite left naval air stations. Navy Base San Diego sprawled across the landscape with utilitarian efficiency, all concrete and chain-link purpose-built structures designed for function rather than aesthetics. Helicopters sat in neat rows on the tarmac, their rotors still waiting. In the distance, the Pacific stretched to the horizon, endless and indifferent. The HSC-85 Squadron Ready Room carried that particular atmosphere of organized chaos that characterized military aviation units. Whiteboards covered in mission schedules and maintenance status. Coffee perpetually brewing in a pot that probably hadn't been properly cleaned in years. Worn leather chairs that had supported countless pre-flight briefings. Photographs on the walls showing crews in desert camouflage and dress uniforms in moments of victory and exhaustion. Lieutenant Commander Sierra Vale stood at the mission planning table reviewing reports with the focused intensity that had become her trademark. She wore her flight suit with the ease of someone for whom it had become a second skin, covered in patches that told a story: U.S. Navy, HSC-85 Golden Gators, an American flag on her right shoulder, and on her chest the trident insignia that marked her as qualified in SEAL support operations, a designation that required not just skill, but the kind of courage that couldn't be taught. At 35, her face carried the particular quality of someone who had been forged through discipline and tested in circumstances that most people couldn't imagine. Her features were sharp, carved lean by years of physical training and mental focus. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, functional bun that spoke of practicality rather than vanity. Her eyes held that steady quality of controlled intensity, the look of someone who had learned to manage fear and exhaustion and still execute with precision. She was reviewing after-action reports from the previous week's training exercises when footsteps approached from behind, measured and familiar. "Sierra, got a minute?" She turned to find Commander James Garrett standing in the doorway, and something in his expression made her set down the tablet immediately. At 64, Garrett carried himself with the particular bearing of career military officers who had earned their authority through decades of service rather than simply time served. His civilian-clothes khakis and a button-down couldn't quite disguise the military posture, the way he inhabited space with quiet confidence. His face was weathered in the way of men who had spent years in cockpits in desert sun carved with lines that spoke of laughter and stress in equal measure. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing, the eyes of someone who had learned to assess situations in seconds and make decisions that determined whether people lived or died. A small American flag pin on his collar was the only indication of his status, but everyone on base knew Commander Garrett. Silver Star from Desert Storm, Distinguished Flying Cross. 30 years flying attack helicopters before retirement had forced him out of the cockpit and into a civilian advisory role that kept him close to the aircraft and the pilots he loved. He had been Sierra's primary instructor during flight school, the one who had seen something in her that others had missed, who had pushed her harder than anyone else precisely because he believed she could take it. "Always, sir," Sierra said, straightening slightly, the automatic response to a man she respected more than almost anyone alive. Garrett crossed the ready room and handed her his tablet without preamble. "Thought you should see this. It was forwarded to the squadron admin email. Someone thought you'd want to know." Sierra took the tablet, her expression neutral, but something in Garrett's tone made her stomach tighten with anticipation. She looked down at the screen and immediately recognized the format of an email thread, the kind where multiple people had replied back and forth, building on each other's comments. The subject line read, "Glen Ridge Academy, Class of 2015 Reunion, Final Guest List." Her eyes moved down the thread, reading quickly at first, then slower as the words began to register with increasing impact. Bridger Castellano. "Okay, finalize the venue. Cascadia Grand Estate, black tie, going to be epic. Question though, should we actually invite Sierra Val? LOL, just kidding. But seriously, should we? Sloan Devereaux, OMG. Yes, Bridger, this is genius. Imagine her face when she walks in and realizes we're all successful and she's, whatever she is. The contrast will be gold." Paxton Reeve. "The class loser returns. This will be absolutely epic." $20 says she doesn't even show up. She probably knows better. Lennox Foss. I'll take that bet. She'll show. People like Sierra always show up. They always hope things have changed. Plus, she probably still thinks about high school constantly. People like her never move on. Sloane Devereaux. She's probably working retail somewhere, maybe waitressing. Can you imagine we pull up in our cars and she's taking the bus? Chef's kiss perfection. Bridger Castellano. Invitation sent. This is going to be the highlight of the whole night. The ghost girl returns. I can't wait. Sierra read the entire thread twice, her face remaining carefully neutral, but Garrett knew her well enough to see the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers gripped the tablet just a fraction harder than necessary. The ready room felt very quiet suddenly. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter was running through engine tests, the turbines building to a whine, then settling. Normal sounds. Normal day. But nothing felt normal in this moment. You don't have to go, Garrett said quietly, his voice carrying the gentle firmness of someone who had earned the right to speak plainly. You don't owe those people anything. Not your time, not your presence, not a single thought. Sierra continued staring at the screen, reading the words again, as if they might change, as if she might have misunderstood their casual cruelty. But there was no misunderstanding. They had invited her specifically to humiliate her, to use her as a prop in their self-congratulation, to remind themselves how much better they were than the ghost girl who had never mattered. She set the tablet down carefully on the table, her movements precise and controlled. No, she said quietly, but I'm going to go anyway. Garrett studied her face, reading the determination there, recognizing something he had seen before in pre-mission briefings, that particular quality of decision that couldn't be argued with or reasoned away. Why, he asked simply. Sierra looked up at him, and her eyes carried something cold and focused, the same intensity that had been visible in that yearbook photo 10 years ago, hidden beneath fragility, but never truly absent. Because I need to see if they've changed, she said, and because I need them to see who I became. The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond their simple construction. This wasn't about revenge, Garrett realized. It was something deeper, something more fundamental. It was about proving to herself that the girl who had walked alone down that graduation sidewalk had become someone who mattered, someone who couldn't be dismissed or forgotten or made invisible again. Garrett nodded slowly, understanding, even if he didn't entirely agree. Then you'll go with your head up. Make sure they understand exactly what they miss it out on. A memory flashed unbidden into Sierra's mind, sharp and vivid. Flight school, Pensacola years ago. The simulator room with its banks of controls and screens. Her first solo qualification flight, the one that would determine if she continued in the program or washed out like so many others before her. She had struggled with the controls, the Apache responding sluggishly to her inputs, fighting her instead of working with her. Sweat had run down her face despite the air conditioning. Her hands had cramped from gripping the stick too hard. The instructor's voice in her headset had grown increasingly skeptical. Vale may be fixed wing is better suited to your capabilities. Not everyone is cut out for rotary wing combat aviation. It had been a gentle way of saying she was failing, that she should give up now before the failure became official and permanent. But then Garrett's voice had cut through, firm and commanding. He wasn't her primary instructor, but he had been watching from the observation booth, and his authority superseded everyone else's. Do it again, and this time stop fighting the aircraft. Partner with her. She had run the simulation again, and again, and again, each time getting slightly better, learning to feel the aircraft's responses, to anticipate rather than react, to flow with the machine instead of trying to dominate it. The landing had been hard, the Apache settling with a jarring impact that made the simulator shake, but she had kept it under control, had brought it down safely, had not crashed. Garrett had appeared at the simulator door as she climbed out, exhausted and drenched in sweat. He had looked at her with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. Again, he had said, "Do it right this time." No praise, no encouragement, just the expectation that she could and would do better. And somehow that had been exactly what she needed. Her internal thought in that moment had been crystal clear. A vow to herself, I didn't survive high school to quit here. I didn't endure all of that just to give up now. She had run the simulation again. And this time she had nailed it. The memory faded, but the determination it carried remained. Sierra picked up her phone and pulled up the base operations contact. Her fingers moved with decision, no hesitation. "Lieutenant Commander Vale," she said when the line connected, "I need to submit a request for aircraft usage. Personal nature. I'll need an Apache and a qualified crew. 2 weeks from now. Duration approximately 4 hours round trip." The operations officer on the other end sounded confused. "Ma'am, can I ask the nature of this request? Personal use of combat aircraft requires special authorization and justification." Sierra glanced at Garrett, who was watching her with something that might have been pride or concern, or both. "Call it a homecoming," she said simply. "I'll submit the formal paperwork within the hour." She ended the call and set the phone down, then turned to fully face Garrett. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The ready room hummed with the background noise of an active military installation life continuing around them, unaware of the decision that had just been made. Garrett's eyes moved past Sierra to the wall behind her, and he gestured with his chin. "You've earned the right to make this call. Whatever you decide, you have earned it." Sierra turned to follow his gaze and found herself looking at the shadow box mounted on the wall, the one she passed every day but rarely really looked at anymore. Inside, against dark blue velvet, rested a medal suspended from a light blue ribbon with 13 white stars. The Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration that could be awarded to a member of the United States Navy, given for extraordinary heroism in combat. Below the medal, a small brass plaque carried an inscription, "For Actions in Yemen, March 2020. Sierra stared at it, the memory of that day flooding back with vivid intensity. The heat, the dust, the sound of enemy fire like angry hornets, the helicopter shaking from damage, the fuel gauge dropping toward zero, the voices of wounded men on the radio desperate, counting on her, the decision she had made to stay. She turned back to Garrett, and when she spoke, her voice carried absolute certainty. "They wanted the ghost," she said quietly. "They sent that invitation thinking I'd show up as nothing as proof of how far they'd come and how far I'd fallen." She paused, her jaw setting with determination. "I'm going to show them a phantom instead." Garrett's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been satisfaction. He had trained combat pilots for 3 decades, had seen thousands of young officers pass through his instruction, but only a handful had possessed this particular quality. This ability to transform pain into fuel to take what was meant to break them and forge it into something unbreakable. "Then make it count," he said simply. "Make sure they understand exactly what they threw away when they made you invisible." Sierra nodded, once sharp and military. The decision was made. The invitation had been sent as a joke, as cruelty disguised as inclusion. But they had made a critical miscalculation. They had assumed that the fragile girl from the yearbook photo had stayed fragile, had remained exactly as they remembered her, frozen in time and defeat. They had forgotten that people can change, that invisibility can be temporary, that ghosts, when they return, come back for a reason. Sierra Vale was going to her high school reunion, but she wasn't going to walk through the door. She wasn't going to arrive in a Honda Civic or a thrift store dress or anything else they had imagined when they were placing their cruel bets and congratulating themselves on their own success. She was going to arrive in a way that none of them could possibly imagine, in a one that would make absolutely certain they understood who she had become and what they had failed to see 10 years ago when they had decided she didn't matter. The Apache attack helicopter waiting on the tarmac outside represented $64 million of American military engineering capable of speeds exceeding 180 miles per hour, armed with weapons that could destroy tanks and level buildings, flown by pilots who had proven themselves in the harshest combat conditions imaginable. And in 2 weeks, one of those pilots was going to bring that machine to a high school reunion. Not for revenge, not even for justice, really, but for something simpler and more profound, to prove to herself once and for all that the girl who had been made invisible had become someone impossible to ignore. The ghost was about to return, and when she did, no one would be laughing anymore. The heat hit like a physical wall the moment the transport aircraft's rear ramp lowered at Pensacola Naval Air Station. It was April 2016, and the Florida sun hammered down with merciless intensity, turning the tarmac into a shimmering mirror of heat that made the air itself seem to ripple and dance. The smell was immediate and overwhelming. Jet fuel salt air from the nearby Gulf, and the particular metallic scent of military installations that never quite faded the accumulated residue of decades of aircraft exhaust and disciplined sweat. Sierra Vale stood at the bottom of the ramp with her sea bag slung over one shoulder, squinting against the brightness, taking her first real look at the place that would either make her or break her over the next 18 months. Around her, 29 other newly minted ensigns and junior officers moved with varying degrees of confidence and anxiety, all of them here for the same brutal selection process, all of them believing they had what it took to earn their wings. Only about half of them would be right. The flight line stretched before them, rows of helicopters in various states of readiness. Training aircraft, mostly older models, that had been through countless student pilots, machines that had absorbed years of mistakes and near crashes and hard landings. But among them, sitting like predators among prey, were the AH-64 Apaches, and Sierra's breath caught slightly at the sight of them. They were smaller than she had imagined, more compact, but somehow that made them more dangerous looking, like coiled springs waiting to explode into motion. The tandem cockpit design gave them an insect-like appearance, predatory and alien. The stub wings bristled with weapons pylons currently empty, but obviously designed for ordnance that could level buildings. The distinctive nose-mounted sensor turret gave them an all-seeing quality, as if they could look into your soul and find you wanting. Sierra had dreamed about these machines for years, had studied their specifications until she could recite performance characteristics. From memory, had watched countless hours of combat footage showing them in action. But seeing them in person close enough to touch was something different entirely. These were the machines that had dominated battlefields from Desert Storm to Afghanistan, that had saved countless lives through close air support and combat rescue, that represented the absolute pinnacle of attack helicopter design. And she was here to learn to fly them. A voice cut through her moment of reverence, sharp and commanding. Listen up. Form up in ranks now. If you can't figure out how to make a straight line, you sure as hell won't figure out how to fly a multi-million-dollar weapon system. The speaker was a lieutenant with instructor wings on his flight suit, his face already red from the heat or anger or both, clearly a man who had been breaking in new students for too long and had lost whatever patience he might once have possessed. Sierra moved quickly, finding her place in the formation, standing at attention with her sea bag at her feet. Around her, others did the same with varying degrees of military precision. Some were prior enlisted, smooth and practiced in their movements. Others were fresh from college ROTC programs, still learning how to exist in this world of rigid structure and unforgiving standards. Welcome to Naval Air Station Pensacola. The instructor continued, pacing in front of them like a predator assessing prey. Some of you think you're here because you are special, because you scored well on tests, because you did good in your basic flight training. Let me be clear about something right now. None of that matters, not here. Here you start from zero. Here you prove you deserve to sit in that cockpit, and most of you won't. He let that sink in, watching faces for reactions, looking for weakness or fear or doubt he could exploit. You're here for one reason: to learn to fly the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter in combat conditions. This is not a sightseeing tour. This is not learning to fly a traffic helicopter or a corporate bird. This is learning to operate a weapon system that will keep American warriors alive while killing the enemy with extreme prejudice. The standards are absolute. The requirements are non-negotiable. You meet them or you wash out. Questions? No one spoke. The formation stood silent in the brutal heat. Outstanding. Fall out to your assigned barracks. 0500 formation tomorrow. Dismissed. The formation broke apart, people grabbing bags and moving toward the buildings, and Sierra had just reached for her own sea bag when a different voice spoke from behind her, quieter but somehow carrying more authority than all the shouting. Your veil. She turned to find a man in his mid-50s watching her with assessment in his eyes. He wore a flight suit with instructor patches, but his bore additional insignia that marked him as something more than just another trainer. Commander rank, combat ribbons that spoke of real experience, and most notably, wings above his name tag that indicated thousands of flight hours in rotary wing aircraft. His name tag read, Deke R.J. Garrett. Yes, sir, Sierra said, coming to attention instinctively. Ensign Sierra Vale reporting as ordered. Commander James Garrett studied her for a long moment, his eyes sharp and evaluating, missing nothing. He was weathered in the way of career pilots, his face carved with lines from years of squinting against sun and concentration, his hands showing the particular calluses of someone who had spent decades gripping flight controls. There was something about him that commanded respect without demanding it, a quiet authority that came from competence rather than rank. "At ease," he said finally. "I'm Commander Garrett. I'll be one of your primary flight instructors for the Apache qualification course. I've reviewed your file. Graduated top 10% from basic flight training. Strong academics. Good physical fitness scores. Excellent performance in your initial rotary wing qualification." Sierra nodded, unsure where this was going. "All of that is interesting," Garrett continued, his tone neutral. "None of it tells me if you can actually fly an Apache in combat. Statistics don't keep people alive when someone's shooting at you. Understanding that difference is what separates pilots who survive from pilots who don't." "I understand, Sir," Sierra said, though she wasn't entirely sure she did yet. Garrett's expression didn't change. "We'll see. Get settled. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start for real and it won't get easier from there." Dismissed. He turned and walked away, and Sierra stood there for a moment watching him go, trying to process the encounter. There had been no warmth in it, but no hostility either. Just assessment, evaluation. The sense of being measured against a standard she couldn't yet see. She picked up her bag and headed toward the barracks, not knowing that the man who had just walked away would become the most important figure in her military career. The one who would see in her what others missed, who would push her harder than anyone else precisely because he believed she could take it. The sun beat down, the heat shimmered. The Apaches sat on the flight line like promises waiting to be fulfilled or broken. And Sierra Vale's real education was about to begin. The simulator room was cold, kept deliberately frigid to prevent the electronics from overheating, and the contrast with the Florida heat outside was jarring. Sierra sat strapped into the mock cockpit, surrounded by screens and controls that replicated the Apache's systems with brutal accuracy. Every switch, every button, every display was exactly where it would be in the actual aircraft. The only difference was that mistakes here wouldn't kill you. They would just end your career. "All right, Vale," came Lieutenant Morrison's voice through her helmet speakers. "This is your third run at the basic weapons employment scenario. You know what you need to do. Target acquisition, lock, and engagement. Clock starts now." The screens flickered to life, showing a simulated landscape of desert terrain. Target indicators appeared on her heads-up display, marking enemy armor positions at varying distances. Her hands moved to the controls, muscle memory from countless hours of study and practice taking over. Except nothing felt right. The targeting system fought her inputs. The Apache's simulated flight characteristics felt wrong, sluggish, like trying to run through water. She knew intellectually what she needed to do, could recite the procedures from memory, but executing them while managing the aircraft's flight profile and weapon systems simultaneously was like trying to solve complex math while someone screamed in your ear. 2 minutes in, she lost control of the simulated aircraft. The screen flashed red. Simulation terminated. Aircraft destroyed. Silence in her helmet for a long moment. "That's 3 failures, Vale," Morrison's voice came back, and she could hear the satisfaction in it, the confirmation of what he had expected all along. "Step out of the simulator." Sierra unstrapped with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline and frustration, climbing out of the cockpit into the cold air of the simulator bay. Morrison stood at the control station, arms crossed, his expression carrying vindication. "Let me be frank with you, Ensign," he said, and his voice had taken on a tone that was almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "This isn't working. You're overthinking every input, second-guessing yourself, fighting the aircraft instead of flying it. Maybe fixed wing is better suited to your particular capabilities. Not everyone is cut out for rotary wing combat aviation, especially not attack helicopters. There's no shame in that." It was a polite way of telling her she was failing, that she should quit now before the failure became official and permanent, before it went on her record as a washout rather than a voluntary lateral transfer. Sierra started to respond to defend herself, or maybe to accept the inevitable, when another voice cut through the room. "Run it again." Everyone turned. Commander Garrett stood in the doorway of the simulator room, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Morrison straightened slightly, the automatic response to superior rank. "Sir, with respect, this is Vale's third consecutive failure on the same basic scenario. I don't think another run will—" "I didn't ask what you think, Lieutenant," Garrett said quietly, but there was steel underneath the calm. "I said run it again." Vale back in the cockpit. Morrison's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Sierra climbed back into the simulator, her heart pounding, not with fear now, but with determination mixed with confusion. Why was Garrett intervening? Why was he giving her another chance when the standard procedure was 3 strikes and you moved to a different program? She strapped back in, and this time Garrett's voice came through her helmet instead of Morrison's. Vale, listen to me carefully. You're trying to muscle the aircraft. You're treating it like an opponent you need to dominate. That's not how she flies. The Apache responds to partnership, not force. Stop thinking about the procedures and feel the aircraft. She'll tell you what she needs if you listen. Sir, I don't understand, son. You will. Start the simulation. The screens flickered to life again. Same scenario, same targets. But this time, instead of trying to remember every procedure step, every checklist item, Sierra tried to do what Garrett said. She closed her eyes for just a second, took a breath, and when she opened them again, she tried to feel rather than think. Her hands moved on the controls. The Apache responded, and this time it felt different, more fluid, like the machine was an extension of her intentions rather than a separate entity she had to control. Target acquisition came naturally. Lock, fire. The simulated Hellfire missile streaked toward its target. Direct hit. She transitioned to the next target, and this time she didn't think about the procedure at all, just responded to what the aircraft was telling her, what her instincts were screaming. Another lock, another engagement, another hit. 4 minutes into the simulation, she had successfully engaged all 6 targets, maintained stable flight throughout, and brought the simulated Apache back to a controlled hover. Simulation complete. All objectives achieved. She sat in the cockpit for a moment, breathing hard, not quite believing what had just happened. The difference had been mental, not physical, a shift in approach that changed everything. Garrett's voice came through her helmet, and she could hear the approval, even though his words remained measured. Better. Still rough, but better. You felt it that time. That's what I need you to remember. Now do it again, and keep doing it until it becomes instinct. Over the next 6 months, Sierra lived in a world of deliberate intensity that broke some people and forged others into something harder. Every day began before dawn with physical training, then moved to classroom instruction on weapon systems and tactics, then simulator time, then actual flight time, then more classroom work, then weapons qualifications, then after-action reviews that dissected every mistake with surgical precision. The Apache was not a forgiving aircraft. It demanded total commitment, absolute focus, and the kind of hand-eye coordination that couldn't be taught, only discovered within yourself, and then refined through thousands of hours of practice. Garrett became her primary instructor, though he never officially replaced Morrison. He simply appeared at her training sessions, offering guidance that was never gentle, but always exactly what she needed. He pushed her harder than anyone else demanded, more accepted nothing less than perfect execution. Again became his most common word. No matter how well she performed, it was always again. Better this time, faster, smoother, more precise. The weapons systems training was perhaps the most intensive part. The Apache's primary armament was the M230 chain gun, a 30mm automatic cannon mounted beneath the nose that could fire 625 rounds per minute with devastating accuracy. Learning to use it effectively meant understanding ballistics, target lead calculations, the effect of wind and aircraft movement on projectile trajectory. The gun is for close targets or suppression, Garrett explained during one training session, standing beside her in the weapons classroom with a cutaway model of the cannon. You use it when you need immediate effect without the time for missile lock. Rate of fire is adjustable from continuous to individual shots. Effective range out to 1,500 meters, but maximum lethality is under 1,000. You need to understand that this weapon will be the difference between your ground forces surviving or dying when things go wrong. The AGM-114 Hellfire missiles were the Apache's primary anti-armor weapon, laser-guided munitions with 8-kilometer range and tandem warheads designed to defeat reactive armor. Each Apache could carry up to 16 of them, though typical loadout was 8 Hellfires plus rocket pods. Hellfire engagement sequence. Garrett drilled into her repeatedly. Acquire target through TADS. Confirm identification. Calculate range and angle. Initiate laser designation. Wait for solid lock tone. Fire. Maintain designation until impact. If you break designation early, the missile goes ballistic and you've wasted a $200,000 weapon and possibly gotten someone killed because that target is still active. Night flying brought its own challenges. The Apache's PNVS system pilot night vision sensor projected thermal imagery directly onto the pilot's helmet display, allowing flight in complete darkness. But interpreting thermal imagery while flying at high speed through terrain required a mental adaptation that took weeks to develop. "You're not looking at the world anymore," Garrett told her during her first night flight training. "You're looking at heat signatures. That bright spot is an engine. That cooler area is water. Those tiny bright spots are people. You need to learn to read this like a language instantly, without thinking, because hesitation at night gets you killed faster than anything else." The tactical training scenarios grew progressively more complex. Simple target engagement became coordinated attacks with multiple aircraft. Static targets became moving vehicles. Clear weather became sandstorms and night operations. Friendly fire considerations were added, requiring instant identification of friendly versus enemy forces in chaotic environments. And always Garrett pushed for more. Faster reaction time, smoother control inputs, better situational awareness, more precise weapons employment. "In combat, you won't have time to think," he reminded her constantly. "You'll have seconds to make decisions that determine if people live or die. Your training has to be so ingrained that your body executes without your conscious mind being involved. That only comes through repetition until it becomes instinct." 6 months in, Sierra had logged over 200 simulator hours and 40 actual flight hours in training Apaches. She had progressed from basic flight to advanced weapons employment to tactical scenarios that replicated actual combat conditions. Her hands bore permanent calluses from gripping controls. Her body had adapted to the physical strain of long flights in full combat gear. Her mind had learned to process multiple information streams simultaneously while making life-or-death decisions in seconds. But she still hadn't qualified. The final qualification flight was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October, 6 months into the program. It was a comprehensive test of everything she had learned: take off, fly a tactical profile to a target area, engage multiple targets with various weapons systems, perform evasive maneuvers, and return to base for precision landing. All while maintaining proper radio procedures, managing fuel consumption, and responding to simulated emergencies injected by the evaluators. Morrison would be her evaluator, flying in the second seat to observe and grade her performance. Pass this evaluation, and she would receive her wings as a naval aviator qualified in the AH-64 Apache. Fail, and she would be moved to a different aircraft type or potentially washed out of the program entirely. The morning was clear wind, calm conditions, ideal. Sierra completed her pre-flight inspection with meticulous care, checking every panel, every connection, every system. The Apache sat on the flight line like a coiled predator waiting. She climbed into the front seat, the pilot's position, and began working through the startup checklist. Behind her, Morrison settled into the co-pilot's seat, his clipboard ready, saying nothing. His silence felt heavy with expectation, probably expecting her to fail to prove him right, that she had been pushed through the program beyond her actual capabilities. Garrett stood on the flight line, watching, his arms crossed, his expression neutral. He had done everything he could. Now it was up to her. "Tower Nighthawk 3-1 ready for departure," Sierra said into her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Nighthawk 3-1 cleared for departure. Maintain heading 270, climb to 1,000 feet. Sierra brought the Apache's engines to flight, power feeling the aircraft come alive beneath her, the turbines building to their distinctive whine. She pulled collective, adding power, and the Apache lifted smoothly from the tarmac, responsive to her inputs, like an extension of her own body. The flight profile took her out over the Gulf of Mexico, where the training ranges were located. Her first target was a simulated armored vehicle, a truck hull at 2,800 meters. She brought the Apache into a stable hover, activated the targeting system, and worked through the Hellfire engagement sequence exactly as she had been taught. Target acquired through TADS. Thermal signature confirmed. Laser designation initiated. Lock tone solid in her helmet. Fire authorization verbalized. Finger on trigger. "Nighthawk 3-1 rifle hot," she announced, and pressed the trigger. The Hellfire leaped from its rail with a burst of rocket motor accelerating rapidly, the laser guidance system riding her designation beam. 3 seconds of flight. The missile impacted the target dead center, the training warhead creating a flash and smoke plume that marked a direct hit. Target destroyed, Morrison's voice came through her helmet flat and professional. Proceed to next objective. The evaluation continued for 40 minutes. Multiple target engagements with Hellfire missiles and the 30mm gun. Evasive maneuvers simulating surface-to-air missile threats. Simulated hydraulic failure requiring emergency procedures. Low-level flight through terrain at high speed. Everything designed to test her skills and decision-making under pressure. And she executed flawlessly. Every target hit. Every procedure correct. Every emergency handled with calm precision. The Apache responded to her inputs like they were in perfect harmony, machine and pilot working as one. The final test was the landing, and Morrison made it harder than it needed to be, directing her to a confined area that required precision, hover work, and careful power management. Sierra brought the Apache in smoothly, controlling her descent, rate managing her power, setting the landing gear on the designated spot with barely a bump. Engine shut down, rotors spinning down, silence gradually replacing the turbine whine. Morrison climbed out without a word. Sierra sat in the cockpit for a moment, suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her shaky. She climbed down to find Garrett waiting. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes carried something that might have been pride. Morrison stood with his clipboard, and when he spoke, his voice carried grudging respect. Textbook execution veil. All objectives achieved within standards. He paused, then added almost reluctantly, recommended for wings qualification. Sierra felt something break inside her, not breaking apart, but breaking through relief and accomplishment, flooding through her with physical intensity. 6 months of brutal training, countless hours of study and practice, the constant pressure of knowing that failure was always one mistake away, and she had made it. Garrett stepped forward and extended his hand. "Welcome to the fleet, Lieutenant. You earned this." The wing ceremony was formal and brief, the kind of military ritual that marks significant transitions with solemn dignity. Sierra stood at attention as the base commander pinned the golden wings to her uniform, the naval aviator insignia that marked her as qualified to fly military aircraft in combat operations. But it was Garrett who handed her the additional patch afterward, the one that would go on her flight suit HSC-85 Golden Gators. "You're assigned to my old squadron," he said quietly. "SEAL support and combat rescue. It's the hardest mission in rotary wing aviation, and that's exactly why I requested you for it. They need pilots who don't quit, pilots who will stay in the fight when everything tells them to run." Sierra took the patch, feeling its weight in her hand, understanding what he was saying beyond the words. This wasn't just about flying helicopters. This was about being trusted with the lives of the most elite warriors. America had the men who went into the worst places on Earth and needed pilots crazy enough or dedicated enough to go in after them when things went wrong. "I won't let you down, sir," she said. "I know," Garrett replied. "That's why you're here." 3 weeks later, Sierra reported to HSC-85 at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. The squadron's ready room carried the accumulated history of decades of operations, walls covered with photographs and plaques, and the particular atmosphere of units that had been tested in combat and survived. The squadron commander was a hard-eyed captain who had flown in both Iraq wars and Afghanistan. She gave Sierra the same assessment everyone gave new pilots. "You're unproven until you're not. Don't get anyone killed while you're learning." Sierra was assigned to a crew with Lieutenant Thatcher Bowen as her co-pilot and weapons officer, a lean man in his late 20s who had 2 deployments under his belt and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had been shot at and survived. The crew chief was Petty Officer Garrett Hollis, no relation to anyone, a perpetually cheerful Texan who treated the Apache like it was his personal possession and got genuinely offended if anyone suggested there might be better aircraft. "Don't worry, ma'am," Hollis told her during their first crew brief. "These birds are tough. They'll bring you home even when you make mistakes, and you will make mistakes. Everyone does the first time someone shoots at them for real." "That's encouraging," Sierra said dryly. "Wasn't meant to be encouraging, ma'am. Just honest." The training flights with HSC-85 were different from flight school, more intense, more focused on the specific mission set. They practiced SEAL insertions flying low and fast to drop teams in a hostile territory, then providing overwatch while they completed their missions. They practiced combat rescue scenarios going into hot landing zones to extract wounded under fire. They practiced close air support coordinating with ground forces to deliver precision strikes danger close to friendly positions. And then 8 months after joining the squadron, Sierra got her first deployment notification. Afghanistan, Forward Operating Base Sharana in Paktika Province, 6-month rotation, high threat environment, heavy combat operations ongoing. Garrett appeared at the squadron the day before she deployed, even though he was technically retired by then and working as a civilian advisor. He pulled her aside in the hangar where she was doing pre-deployment checks on her assigned Apache. "First deployment is always the hardest," he said without preamble. "You've trained for this, you are ready, but nothing quite prepares you for the first time someone shoots at you for real. The training takes over, but there's always that moment of realization that this is real, that you can actually win, that the decisions you make matter in ways they never did in training." Sierra nodded, absorbing his words. "You're going to be scared sometimes," Garrett continued. "That's normal. That's healthy. Fear keeps you sharp. What matters is what you do with that fear. You use it, you channel it into focus. You trust your training and your crew, and you execute your mission. That's all anyone can ask." "What if I freeze?" Sierra asked, voicing the fear she hadn't spoken to anyone else. "What if I get out there and I can't?" "You won't," Garrett said with absolute certainty. "I've trained enough pilots to know the difference between the ones who will hold steady and the ones who won't. You're one of the ones who will. I've known that since the first time I watched you refuse to quit in that simulator. You don't have quit in you, Sierra. It's not in your nature." He reached into his flight bag and pulled out a small patch, worn and faded, showing an Apache silhouette with the word Nighthawk beneath it. "This was my call sign when I flew," he said, handing it to her. "You remind me of why I chose it. Nighthawks hunt in the dark when everyone else has gone home, when the mission seems impossible. They don't quit. They adapt and overcome. I want you to have this." Sierra took the patch, feeling the weight of what he was giving her, understanding that this was more than just a piece of fabric. This was trust. This was the passing of something important from one generation to the next. "I'll bring it back," she promised. "I know you will," Garrett said. "Now go make me proud." The transport aircraft lifted off the next morning, carrying Sierra and the rest of her squadron rotation toward a war zone on the other side of the world, toward challenges she could imagine but not truly understand until she faced them, toward the experiences that would forge her into the pilot she was meant to become. The first time someone shot at her for real, 3 weeks into the deployment, Bowen's voice came sharp in her helmet. "Ground fire, 9 o'clock. Sierra's hands moved before her conscious mind processed the words, banking. The Apache hard-dropping altitude, putting terrain between them and the threat. Tracers arced through the space where they had been seconds before, bright streaks in the darkness. Her heart hammered. Her mouth went dry. Fear flooded through her with physical intensity. And then training took over. "Talk to me, TAC," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "What are we looking at?" "PKM position ridgeline, approximately 400 meters. Bowen replied, already working the targeting system. "Small arms, not significant threat at this range." The SEAL team they were supporting came over the radio. "Nighthawk 3-1, we need that position suppressed. We're taking effective for decision point." They could break off stay safe call for other assets. Or they could go back in, put themselves in the line of fire, suppress that position so the men on the ground could complete their mission. Sierra thought about Garrett, thought about his words, thought about the patch now sewn onto her flight suit. Nighthawks hunt in the dark. "I'm going back in," she said. "TAC, get me a firing solution." "Roger that," Bowen said, and she could hear the approval in his voice. "Guns, guns, guns." Sierra brought the Apache around in a tight turn, diving toward the ridgeline, and opened up with the 30mm chain gun. The sound was distinctive, a deep rhythmic hammering that you felt in your chest as much as heard. The ridgeline erupted in explosions of dust and rock as high explosive rounds tore through the position. The return fire stopped immediately. "Target suppressed," Bowen announced. "Sector clear." The SEAL team leader's voice came through, professional but carrying a relief. "Good hits, Nighthawk. Thanks for the assist." Sierra pulled the Apache back to altitude, her hands rock steady now. The fear transformed into something else, something useful. Adrenaline still flooded her system, but it felt different now. Controlled, channeled. She had been shot at for the first time, had gone back into fire to support her mission, had trusted her training and her crew, and had succeeded. Back at the forward operating base after the mission debrief, she sat alone in the crew quarters and looked at the Nighthawk patch on her flight suit. She thought about this girl who had sat alone in the cafeteria reading engineering textbooks, thought about the word ghost spray-painted on her locker, thought about walking down that sidewalk after graduation alone, heading towards something she could barely imagine. That girl seemed very far away now, and yet Sierra understood she was still there, still part of who she had become. The invisibility that had been forced upon her had taught her to rely on herself, to build strength internally rather than externally. The isolation had taught her self-sufficiency. The mockery had taught her that other people's opinions didn't define her worth. All of it had prepared her for this. Over the next 10 months in Afghanistan, Sierra flew 73 combat missions. She provided close air support for ground forces. She inserted and extracted SEAL teams in hostile territory. She flew medevac missions under fire, bringing wounded warriors to medical facilities that saved their lives. She learned what it meant to make life or death decisions in seconds, to trust her instincts, to push through fear and exhaustion in the constant stress of combat operations. And she learned that she was good at this. Not just competent, but genuinely skilled, one of those pilots that ground forces specifically requested because they knew she would stay in the fight when things got bad, that she wouldn't abandon them when they needed her most. The SEAL team started asking for her by call sign. Nighthawk became known as a pilot who would come get you no matter how hot the landing zone, who would stay on station providing fire support until her fuel ran to minimum, who executed with a precision that made hard missions look easy. Her reputation grew quietly but steadily, the kind of reputation that mattered in the special operations community, earned through consistent performance, under pressure rather than through self-promotion or politics. By the time she rotated back to San Diego, she had been recommended for early promotion to lieutenant commander, an assignment as a flight lead authorized to command multi-aircraft missions. She was 29 years old and had proven herself in ways that mattered to the people whose opinions actually counted. Garrett met her at the squadron when she returned, older now, but still carrying that same assessing gaze, still missing nothing. "Heard good things about your deployment," he said simply. "The team speak highly of you. That's the only evaluation that matters in this business." "I had good training, sir," Sierra replied. "Training only gets you so far. The rest is character. You had that before I ever met you. I just helped you find it." They stood together in the hangar, looking at the Apaches being prepped for the next deployment, and Sierra realized that she had found something she had been searching for without knowing it. A place where she belonged, where her skills mattered, where she was valued not for her social standing or appearance, but for what she could do when it counted. She had become someone who mattered, not because anyone gave her permission or acknowledged her worth, but because she had earned it through dedication and sacrifice and refusing to quit when everything told her to. The ghost girl from high school would barely recognize the woman she had become, and that, Sierra thought, was exactly the point. The coffee in Sierra's apartment had gone cold an hour ago, but she hadn't noticed. She sat at her small kitchen table with her laptop open, staring at the reunion website for the Glen Ridge Academy class of 2015, watching the RSVP list grow as more names appeared. Bridger Castellano, Sloan Devereaux, Paxton Reeve, Lennox Foss, all confirmed attending, probably already planning what they would wear, how they would present themselves, what stories they would tell to prove how successful they had become. The apartment was sparse, almost military in its minimalism. A small sofa, a television that was rarely turned on, bookshelves lined with technical manuals and military history. On one wall, framed photographs showed her crew in Afghanistan in their flight suits beside the Apache, exhausted and alive. Another photo captured a sunset over the Pacific taken from the cockpit during a training flight. A third showed her shaking hands with a SEAL team commander after a particularly difficult mission, both of them covered in dust and dried sweat. There were no photographs from high school, no yearbooks, no mementos of those years. She had left all of that behind, deliberately refusing to carry that weight forward into the life she was building. But now, with the reunion 2 weeks away, those memories had forced themselves back to the surface, whether she wanted them or not. Her phone buzzed. A text from Garrett, still going through with it. She typed back, yes. 3 dots appeared as he typed, then good, make it count. Sierra set the phone down and opened a different folder on her laptop, one containing official photographs from her Navy Cross ceremony the previous year. She studied the image of herself standing at attention while the Secretary of the Navy pinned the medal to her uniform. Her face was composed professional, showing none of the complex emotions she had felt in that moment. Pride, yes, but also grief for the men who hadn't made it home from other missions, and the heavy weight of understanding what that medal represented, a moment when she had been willing to die to keep others alive. The mission citation read, "For extraordinary heroism while serving as pilot in command of an AH-64D Apache helicopter during combat operations against enemy forces in Yemen. Lieutenant Commander Vale's exceptional courage under fire, remarkable aerial skill, and unwavering dedication to mission accomplishment were directly responsible for the survival of 12 United States Marines in extreme danger. Her actions reflected great credit upon herself and were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. Dry military language that couldn't possibly capture what those 6 hours had actually been like. The fear, the exhaustion, the moment when she had looked at the fuel gauge showing 2% remaining and realized she might not make it back, but had decided it didn't matter because those men on the ground were not going to die alone. She closed the laptop and stood moving to the window. San Diego spread out below her, apartment lights beginning to come on as the evening approached. Somewhere out there in expensive houses and trendy neighborhoods, Bridger and Sloan and the others were probably getting ready for dinner parties or social events, living their carefully curated lives, never thinking about the girl they had tormented a decade ago. They had assumed she had disappeared into obscurity, had become nothing, had fulfilled their expectations of failure. They were about to learn how wrong they had been. The next morning, Sierra reported to the HSC-85 Squadron Operations Office with her formal request. The operations officer, a lieutenant commander who had flown with her in Afghanistan, read through the paperwork with increasing incredulity. "Ma'am, just to be clear, you're requesting authorization to use an AH-64D Apache helicopter for personal transportation to a civilian event, a high school reunion." "That's correct," Sierra said calmly. "The fuel costs alone will be significant, plus crew time, maintenance hours, the optics of military assets being used for personal purposes." He trailed off clearly, trying to find a diplomatic way to say this was insane. "All of which I've addressed in the supporting documentation," Sierra replied. "This qualifies as a cross-country navigation training flight with full crew complement, which falls within authorized training and parameters. The destination happens to coincide with a personal event, but the flight itself serves valid training purposes. We'll file a proper flight plan, maintain all standard protocols, and document everything appropriately." The operations officer looked at her for a long moment, then a slow smile spread across his face. "This is about making a point, isn't it? Let's call it demonstrating the effectiveness of naval aviation to a civilian audience," Sierra said with the faintest hint of a smile. He laughed and signed the authorization. "I want pictures. The whole squadron is going to want to hear about this." Sierra's next stop was the maintenance hangar, where she found her regular crew chief, Petty Officer Garrett Hollis, performing post-flight inspection on their assigned Apache. He looked up as she approached, wiping grease from his hands. "Morning, ma'am. We going up today?" "Not today, but I need to talk to you about a special flight in 2 weeks." She explained the plan, watching his expression transform from confusion to delight. "Ma'am, that is the most outstanding use of military aviation I have ever heard of," he said, grinning widely. "When do we brief the crew?" "This afternoon. I also need to ask if you want to volunteer for this. It's not a required mission, and if anyone's uncomfortable with the optics—" "Are you kidding?" Hollis interrupted. "Ma'am, I've been working on this bird for 3 years. The opportunity to use her to make your high school bullies wet themselves, I'm in. No question." Sierra found Lieutenant Thatcher Bowen in the squadron ready room reviewing navigation charts for an upcoming training exercise. He was a quiet man, methodical and precise, the kind of co-pilot who made her job easier through sheer competence. She had trusted him with her life in Afghanistan, and that trust had been earned through dozens of missions where his calm professionalism had kept them alive. "Tack, got a minute?" He looked up, marking his place in the chart. "Always, ma'am. What's up?" She explained the reunion, the invitation that had been meant as mockery, and her plan to arrive via Apache. She expected skepticism, maybe concern about the appropriateness. What she got was Bowen's rare, genuine smile. "That's beautiful," he said simply. "Poetic justice delivered by $64 million of American air power. When do we launch?" The third crew member was the newest addition to their team. Petty Officer Declan Hayes, a weapons specialist barely 24 years old, but with the kind of intense focus that made him exceptional at his job. Sierra found him in the armory, cataloging missiles with the care most people reserved for newborn infants. "Hayes, need to talk to you about a volunteer mission." He straightened immediately. "Yes, ma'am. What's the target?" "My high school reunion. We're taking the Apache." Hayes blinked, processing this information, then his face split into a wide grin. "Ma'am, that's the most badass thing I've ever heard. I'm absolutely in. Can we do a low pass first? Really rattle the windows. We're keeping this professional, Hayes." "Roger that, ma'am. Professional traumatization of civilian bullies. I can work with that." The crew brief happened that afternoon in a small conference room away from the main ready room. Sierra laid out the full planned flight path, timing landing zone assessment, all the technical details that would make this work safely and legally. But she also explained why she was doing this, and her crew deserved to understand. 10 years ago, these people made me invisible," she told them. "They decided I didn't matter, that I was nothing, that I would never amount to anything worth acknowledging. They invited me to this reunion as a joke, expecting me to show up and prove them right. Instead, I'm going to show them exactly who I became and what they failed to see." Bowen nodded slowly. "It's not about revenge. It's about truth." "Exactly," Sierra said. "They get to see the consequences of their miscalculation. And we get a solid cross-country training flight with full mission planning and execution. Plus, we get to land an attack helicopter at a fancy party," Hollis added. "Let's not pretend that's not also awesome." The following week was consumed with mission planning that was probably more detailed than necessary, but Sierra wasn't taking chances. She filed flight plans with the FAA, coordinated with local air traffic control, studied the terrain around the Cascadia Grand Estate, identified optimal approach routes, and calculated fuel requirements with multiple contingency options. Garrett appeared at the squadron 3 days before the flight, ostensibly as a civilian advisor reviewing training protocols, but really to check on her. "You nervous?" he asked as they walked the flight line together. "About the flying numb, about seeing them again." She paused. "I don't know. Part of me wants to just not show up to let them wait and wonder. Prove they're not even worth my time." "But you are showing up," Garrett observed. Why? Sierra thought about that question, trying to articulate something she hadn't fully examined herself. "Because I need to close this chapter. I need to stand in front of them and know that their opinions don't have power over me anymore. That the girl they tormented became someone they can't diminish or dismiss. Does that make sense?" "Complete sense," Garrett said. "You're not doing this for revenge. You're doing this for closure. There's a difference, and it's important that you understand that difference." "What if they don't care?" Sierra asked quietly. "What if I show up in the Apache and they just shrug it off? What if it doesn't matter to them at all?" Garrett stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Then that tells you everything you need to know about them." "But Sierra, I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think you're going to walk in there and they're going to realize, maybe for the first time in their lives, that actions have consequences. That the people they hurt don't just disappear. That cruelty leaves marks. You're not responsible for how they react. You're only responsible for standing in your truth." The night before the flight, Sierra laid out her flight suit with care, making sure every patch was properly positioned. The HSC-85 Golden Gators patch on her right shoulder, the American flag on her left, her name tape, her rank insignia, and on her chest the small ribbon bar that represented her Navy Cross, barely an inch wide but carrying enormous weight. She thought about the girl in the yearbook photo, pale and fragile with oversized glasses. Thought about sitting alone in the cafeteria while life happened around her. Thought about the word ghost dripping wet paint on her locker. Thought about walking away from graduation with no one to witness the moment. That girl had survived, had endured, had refused to let their cruelty define her limitations, had found her way to something they couldn't imagine, had proven herself in ways they would never understand. Tomorrow they would meet the woman that girl had become. Sierra set her alarm and went to bed sleeping dreamlessly, with the calm of someone who had made peace with a difficult decision. The morning of the reunion dawned clear and calm, perfect flying weather. Sierra arrived at the squadron before sunrise, going through her pre-flight routine with meditative focus. Physical training first, then a light breakfast, then into her flight suit. Each action deliberate and familiar, preparing her mind and body for what lay ahead. The crew assembled at the Apache with military precision. Hollis had the aircraft prepped and ready, every system checked and double-checked. Bowen arrived with navigation charts marked and radio frequencies programmed. Hayes loaded their helmets and survival gear with careful attention. "Birds ready, ma'am," Hollis reported. "Fuel topped off, all systems green. She's eager to fly." Sierra conducted her walk-around inspection, checking every panel and control surface, looking for anything that might indicate a problem. The Apache sat gleaming in the early morning light, sleek and dangerous, a machine designed for a singular purpose and optimized for that purpose through decades of refinement. The nose art had been temporarily modified, Hollis's work from the night before. Below the cockpit in stylized letters was the word Nighthawk, with a ghost silhouette incorporated into the design. A callback to the mockery transformed into a symbol of strength. "Hollis, this is beautiful," Sierra said, running her hand over the artwork. "Figured if we're making a statement, might as well make it clear," he replied. "Besides, ghosts are scary when they come back." The flight crew brief was quick and professional. Route of flight weather conditions, radio procedures, emergency protocols. They ran through everything twice, leaving nothing to chance. This might be a statement, but it was also a legitimate military flight and would be conducted to full standards. "Any questions?" Sierra asked. "Just one, ma'am," Hayes said. "When we land, are we weapons hot or cold?" "Hayes, we are not engaging targets at my high school reunion." "Roger that, ma'am. Weapons cold. Psychological warfare only." They mounted up Sierra in the front seat pilot position, Bowen behind her in the co-pilot gunner station. The Apache's twin General Electric turboshaft engines whined to life, building to their operational roar. The rotor blades began turning slowly at first, then accelerating into a blur. "Tower Nighthawk 3-1 ready for departure," Sierra transmitted. "Nighthawk 3-1 cleared for departure. Maintain heading 340, climb and maintain 3,000 feet." Sierra pulled collective adding power smoothly, and the Apache lifted from the tarmac with the grace of a machine that weighed over 10,000 pounds, but flew like it weighed nothing. She transitioned to forward flight, accelerating, the ground dropping away below them. San Diego fell behind as they headed north following the coastline. The Pacific stretched to their left, endless blue, meeting endless sky. The flight would take approximately 90 minutes at cruising speed, giving them plenty of time to run system checks and prepare for the landing. "How are you feeling, boss?" Bowen asked over the internal comms. "Steady," Sierra replied. "Focused, ready." "Good, because we're about to make one hell of an entrance." The miles passed beneath them, cities and towns, highways and fields, the varied landscape of the Pacific Northwest unfolding like a map. Sierra flew with automatic precision, her hands and feet making constant small adjustments to maintain altitude and heading, but her mind was elsewhere, preparing for what was coming. Garrett's voice came over the radio, unexpected. He must have arranged frequency access somehow. "Nighthawk 3-1 Ironhawk." Sierra smiled at the call sign he hadn't used in years. "Ironhawk, Nighthawk 3-1, go ahead. Just wanted to say I'm proud of you, kid. Whatever happens next, you've already won. They just don't know it yet." "Thanks, sir. That means everything." "Give 'em hell. Ironhawk out." The radio went silent again, but Sierra felt steadier, knowing that the man who had believed in her when she barely believed in herself was watching, supporting her, even from a distance. As they approached Seattle airspace, Sierra began her descent, coordinating with air traffic control for clearance to their destination. The Cascadia Grand Estate was in an area that allowed helicopter operations with proper notification, and she had filed all necessary paperwork weeks ago. "Nighthawk 3-1 Seattle approach. You're cleared to proceed to your destination. Maintain VFR conditions report when landing is complete." "Roger, cleared to destination VFR Nighthawk 3-1. She dropped lower following the terrain, and Bowen called out landmarks as they approached. In the distance, she could see the estate, an elegant sprawl of manicured grounds and classical architecture, already filling with expensive cars for the evening's event. "Target in sight," Bowen said with deliberate military formality, and despite everything, Sierra had to suppress a smile. Beginning approach, she replied. The sun was setting golden hour light, painting everything in warm tones, and Sierra could see people gathered on the rooftop bar and outside the ballroom mingling with drinks in hand, completely unaware of what was about to happen. She adjusted her approach, lining up for a landing on the large lawn area adjacent to the main building. The Apache descended steadily, and she could see people beginning to notice faces turning upward, confusion starting to register. The rotor wash hit the ground, creating a massive dust cloud tearing at the carefully manicured grass, and suddenly the elegant party atmosphere transformed into chaos. People stumbled back from windows, drinks forgotten, staring upward at the attack helicopter materializing from the evening sky. Inside the ballroom, the music had stopped abruptly. Through the window, Sierra could see the crowd surging toward exits, trying to understand what was happening, whether they should be afraid or amazed or both. She brought the Apache into a hover 20 feet above the lawn, holding position with absolute stability, and let them look. Let them see the weapons pylons, the targeting systems, the sheer overwhelming presence of a machine designed for war appearing at their party like a judgment from above. Then she descended the final distance, landing gear touching grass with gentle precision despite the violence of the rotor wash around them. She reduced power gradually, letting the rotor spin down, and in the growing silence she could hear screaming, shouting confusion carrying across the distance. The rotor slowed to a stop. The engines wound down. Sudden quiet after the mechanical thunder, broken only by the settling tick of cooling metal and distant voices filled with shock. Sierra took a breath, then another, steadying herself. Through the canopy, she could see 200 people gathered outside, now staring at the Apache, at her, trying to process what they were witnessing. She popped the canopy release and climbed out smoothly, her boots finding the landing gear step, then touching grass. Behind her, Bowen, Hollis, and Hayes dismounted with military precision, forming up in professional formation. Sierra stood beside the Apache in her flight suit, patches visible, the Navy Cross ribbon on her chest catching the fading sunlight. She removed her helmet and tucked it under her arm, and the crowd's murmuring grew louder as they began to recognize. Her began to understand who had just landed a combat helicopter at their reunion. She began walking toward the building, her crew falling in behind her, and the crowd parted without conscious decision, people stepping aside to create a path. Their faces showed shock, confusion, awe, and in some cases the dawning horror of realization. Near the entrance she spotted them. Bridger Castellano, his face drained of color, mouth hanging open. Sloane Devereaux, her phone dangling forgotten in her hand, all her careful curation abandoned in the face of something she couldn't process. Paxton Reeve gripping a railing as if he needed support to remain standing. Lennox Foss backing away slowly, his restless energy transformed into something like fear. Sierra stopped directly in front of Bridger, the one who had thrown that crumpled test paper at her head, who had led the mocking salutes at career day, who had laughed hardest at her pain. "You sent me an invitation," she said quietly, her voice calm and carrying in the shocked silence. Bridger stammered, his mouth working, but producing nothing coherent. Yes, we thought. "You thought it would be funny," Sierra continued, cutting him off gently. "You invited me as a joke, so you could all feel better about yourselves by using me as a contrast. The ghost girl returns, right? The class loser who would prove how successful you'd all become." Sloane's face was white, all her influencer poise evaporated. "I got the email thread," Sierra said, looking at each of them in turn. "Someone forwarded it to me. I read every word. The bets about what I'd wear, whether I'd show up, how entertaining it would be to see me realize how much better you'd all done than me." She paused, letting that sink in, letting them understand that she knew exactly what they had intended. "I came because I wanted to see if any of you had changed," she said simply. "If maybe you'd grown up, become better people, developed some empathy or self-awareness." Another pause, longer this time. "You haven't." Paxton found his voice first, that lawyer's instinct to defend. "Sierra, we were young. We didn't understand. You were 18. Sierra cut him off, her voice still calm but carrying an edge now. "Old enough to enlist, old enough to vote, old enough to know that cruelty has consequences. You understood perfectly. You just didn't care." Sloane's phone slipped from her hand, clattering on the marble floor. No one moved to pick it up. "I didn't come here for an apology," Sierra continued. "I came here so you would understand something very simple. The people you hurt don't disappear. They don't stay broken. Sometimes they become something you can't ignore. She looked at each of them one final time. Enjoy your reunion. She walked past them without waiting for a response, moving into the ballroom, where the projection screen still displayed yearbook photos. The crowd followed, unable to help themselves, drawn by the surreal nature of what was unfolding. The screen cycled to her old yearbook photo, and the contrast was visible to everyone. That fragile girl with oversized glasses, and standing below it, now the woman in the flight suit with the military bearing and the medals earned in combat. A voice called from the back of the room, older, carrying authority. "Lieutenant Commander Vale." Sierra turned to find a man in his early 60s approaching, wearing khakis and a casual button-down, but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. It took her a moment to place him, then recognition hit. Commander Garrett, but not just visiting her squadron. Here at the reunion, having driven from San Diego specifically for this moment. "Commander Garrett," she said, surprise and gratitude flooding through her. "Sir, I didn't know you were coming." He smiled, that rare, genuine expression she had seen so seldom during training. "Wouldn't miss this for the world. Wanted to see the look on their faces myself." He turned to address the entire room, his voice carrying the command presence of a career officer who had led men in combat and earned their loyalty through competence rather than rank alone. "For those who don't know," Garrett said, his voice carrying command authority that silenced the room instantly. "Lieutenant Commander Vale flies combat rescue missions in hostile territory. 2 years ago, she stayed under fire for 6 hours to extract 12 Marines. Took damage, ran out of fuel, and still brought every one of them home alive." He paused, letting the weight settle. "She was awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism." The room went absolutely still. The second highest combat decoration in the United States military, and most of them had never heard of it. He turned to Sierra and with absolute formality came to attention and rendered a sharp salute. Sierra returned the salute, her hand trembling slightly, overwhelmed by the gesture and what it represented. This wasn't just her old instructor acknowledging her. This was one warrior honoring another publicly, recognizing her achievements in the language of military respect that transcended words. From the crowd, 3 other men stepped forward, older gentlemen wearing hats or jackets that marked them as veterans. They had probably come to the reunion with their families, former military who had settled in the area. One by one, they too came to attention and saluted her. Sierra returned each salute, fighting to maintain her composure, understanding that these men recognized something in her that the wealthy civilians could never comprehend: the price of that ribbon on her chest, the weight of the decisions she had made, the burden of command in combat. The projection screen changed again, someone in the AV booth having found a recent photograph. It showed Sierra in her combat gear, standing beside her Apache in Afghanistan, her crew around her, all of them covered in dust and exhaustion, the helicopter showing visible battle damage. The contrast with the yearbook photo was devastating, a visual representation of transformation that needed no explanation. Someone in the crowd began crying. Others stood in shocked silence, trying to process what they were witnessing, trying to reconcile their memories of the ghost girl with the decorated combat pilot standing before them. Sloane stood frozen, her phone recording, but her hands shaking so badly the footage would be unusable. All her careful curation, her perfected image, it seemed suddenly hollow and meaningless in comparison to something real and earned and forged through actual sacrifice. Paxton had sunk onto a chair, his attorney's armor of skepticism shattered, unable to construct any defense or rationalization for what they had done, for what they had failed to see. Bridger stood near the doorway, his face reflecting something that might have been shame or simply shock, his comfortable arrogance stripped away to reveal the emptiness beneath. Lennox had disappeared, entirely unable to face what was happening, his restless energy transformed into simple flight. Sierra stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by 200 people, no longer invisible, no longer dismissible, no longer the ghosts they had created through their cruelty. She was simply herself, fully present, commanding attention, not through aggression or performance, but through the simple fact of who she had become. And in that moment, she realized something profound. Their opinions didn't matter anymore. They had never mattered, and not really. The power they had held over her existed only because she had given it to them, had allowed their judgment to define her worth. But she had taken that power back, not through this dramatic arrival, but through years of dedication and sacrifice, and refusing to quit when everything told her she wasn't good enough. The Apache landing was just the visible symbol of internal transformation that had been happening all along. She turned and walked toward the doors that led to the outside terrace, needing air, needing space. Behind her, Garrett nodded to the crew who quietly followed, maintaining professional bearing, even as the crowd's whispers and exclamations grew louder. On the terrace, Sierra gripped the railing and took deep breaths of cool evening air. The Pacific stretched in the distance, barely visible in the gathering darkness. Behind her, she could hear the chaos inside, people arguing and exclaiming and trying to understand. Footsteps approached, lighter than the crew's military stride. She turned to find a woman in her mid-30s with tears streaming down her face. It took Sierra a moment to place her. Hannah Mercer, a classmate who had never been directly cruel but had never intervened either, who had witnessed the bullying and done nothing. "Sierra," Hannah said, her voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I saw what they did to you every day. I saw it, and I did nothing. I never stood up for you. I never told them to stop. I just let it happen." Sierra studied her, seeing genuine remorse in her face, genuine shame. "You deserved better," Hannah continued. "You deserved friends. You deserved people who would defend you. Instead, you got silence and cruelty, and I'm part of that. I'm so sorry." Sierra nodded slowly, accepting the apology, even if she couldn't quite forgive, yet understanding that Hannah's guilt was real, even if it came too late to matter. "Thank you for saying that," Sierra said quietly. "It takes courage to acknowledge failure." "What you've become," Hannah said, shaking her head in wonder. "What you've achieved. You're extraordinary. You're everything they said you couldn't be, and more. Thank you for showing us, for showing me, friend. I'll never forget this." She turned and walked back inside, leaving Sierra alone with her thoughts, until Garrett appeared beside her, standing quietly at the railing. "How do you feel?" he asked. Sierra considered the question carefully. "Relieved. Like I closed a door that needed closing. They don't have power over me anymore. Maybe they never really did, but I needed to prove that to myself." "And now you have," Garrett said. "Now you can let it go completely. Move forward without that weight." They stood in comfortable silence for a few moments. Then Sierra straightened. "We should head back. I've made my point. Anything more would just be cruelty, and I'm not interested in that." "Agreed," Garrett said. "Besides, you've got an early training flight tomorrow. Being a decorated combat pilot doesn't excuse you from the daily grind." Sierra smiled, grateful for his ability to bring things back to normal, to remind her that this moment, as significant as it felt, was just one moment in an ongoing life that had purpose and meaning beyond this confrontation. They walked back through the ballroom, and this time people moved aside with something closer to respect than shock. Some reached out as if to speak, to apologize or explain, but Sierra kept moving, acknowledging no one, simply passing through on her way back to the aircraft and the life she had built. Outside, the Apache waited on the torn grass exactly as they had left it. The crew had already begun pre-flight checks, professional, even in these bizarre circumstances. Sierra conducted her walk around it, checking for any damage from the landing, finding none. "Birds ready, ma'am," Hollis reported. "Whenever you want to go home." Sierra climbed into the cockpit, settling into the familiar seat, reaching for familiar controls. Bowen climbed into the co-pilot position behind her, and Hayes and Hollis secured themselves in the crew compartment. "Tower Nighthawk 3-1 ready for departure," she transmitted. Through the canopy, she could see the crowd gathered at the windows again, watching. Bridger stood at the glass, his hand pressed against it, his face showing emotions she couldn't read from this distance, and no longer cared to interpret. The engines spooled up. The rotors began to turn, accelerating into their distinctive whoop, whoop, whoop that announced the Apache's presence with unmistakable authority. The rotor wash kicked up another dust cloud, and through it, Sierra could see people shielding their faces, backing away from windows. She pulled collective, and the Apache lifted smoothly, rising above the estate, banking away toward the south and home. The reunion fell behind them, growing smaller, and Sierra felt something release in her chest, tension she had been carrying for years finally letting go. "Nighthawk 3-1, how copy?" Garrett's voice came over the radio again. "Loud and clear, Ironhawk." "Outstanding execution, Commander." "Welcome home." "Thank you, sir, for everything." The flight back to San Diego was peaceful, following the coastline in the gathering darkness, navigation lights blinking, the Pacific stretching endlessly to their left. Sierra flew with relaxed precision, no longer needing to prove anything, simply enjoying the pure experience of flight. Boss Bowen said over internal comms, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever been part of. Thank you for including us. Couldn't have done it without you, Tack. Any of you." Still, Hayes chimed in from the crew compartment, "We're going to be telling that story for the rest of our careers. The time we crashed a high school reunion in an Apache. Legend." "Let's maybe not use the word crashed in official reports," Sierra suggested, but she was smiling. They landed at Naval Air Station North Island 90 minutes later, touching down on the familiar tarmac as the last light faded from the western sky. The post-flight procedures were routine and comforting. Shutting down systems in proper sequence, conducting inspections, logging flight times. The squadron duty officer approached as they were securing the aircraft. "Commander Vale, you've got about 6 million views on social media. Someone filmed the whole thing. It's everywhere." Sierra blinked, not having considered that possibility. 6 million. And climbing. The comments are overwhelmingly positive. Veterans groups are sharing it. People posting about their own bully stories and how this gave them hope. You're kind of having a moment. Sierra wasn't sure how she felt about that, but Garrett appeared beside her and put it in perspective. "Let them celebrate," he said quietly. "Your story means something to people who felt invisible or dismissed. That's not a bad thing, but don't let it define you. You're not a viral moment. You're a naval officer with a job to do. Tomorrow you get back to that job." "Yes, sir," Sierra said, grateful for the grounding. 1 week later, Sierra sat in her apartment with morning coffee, this time hot and fresh, checking her email before heading to the squadron. Among the usual military correspondence and administrative notifications, one message stood out. From Hannah Mercer, subject, "Thank you." The message was brief. "I've been thinking about what you said about courage to acknowledge failure. I've started volunteering with an anti-bullying organization, speaking at schools about my experience and my regrets. I can't change what I didn't do 10 years ago, but I can try to help prevent it from happening to others. Thank you for being the catalyst for that change. I hope you're well. You deserve every good thing." Sierra read it twice, then closed her laptop. She couldn't absolve Hannah, or any of them couldn't grant forgiveness that would erase their failures. But she could acknowledge that people could grow, could change, could learn from their mistakes if they chose to, and she could choose to move forward without carrying their weight anymore. At the squadron that morning, life returned to normal with comforting swiftness. Training flights were scheduled. Maintenance issues were addressed. New pilots arrived for qualification training. The rhythm of military aviation continued with indifferent momentum, and Sierra was grateful for it. Garrett appeared in the afternoon, officially present as a civilian advisor, but really there to check on her. "How are you doing?" he asked as they walked the flight line together, watching crews prep aircraft for afternoon flights. "Good," Sierra said and meant it. "Really good, actually. I feel lighter, like I put down something heavy I'd been carrying without realizing it." "That's exactly what you did," Garrett said. "You confronted the past, proved you'd moved beyond it, and now you get to leave it behind completely. That's healthy, that's growth." They stopped beside Sierra's assigned Apache, and she ran her hand along the fuselage with affection. "This is where I belong," she said quietly. "Not in their world of carefully curated success and hollow achievements. Here with the aircraft and the mission and the people who understand what actually matters." "You always belonged here," Garrett said. "You just had to find your way to it. But you did find it, Sierra. Against all the odds, despite everything working against you, you found exactly where you were meant to be. That's not luck. That's character." A young ensign approached nervously, fresh from flight school, assigned to the squadron for Apache qualification. She stopped a respectful distance away, waiting for acknowledgement. "Can I help you, Ensign?" Sierra asked. "Ma'am, I'm Ensign Collins. I just got assigned to HSC 85. I saw the video from your reunion. I was bullied in high school too badly, and I almost quit trying to become a pilot because I didn't think I was good enough. But seeing what you did, seeing what you became, it made me realize I could do this too. I just wanted to thank you and to ask if maybe someday, when I'm qualified, I could fly with your crew." Sierra looked at the young woman, seeing herself a decade ago, uncertain and damaged, but refusing to give up, and felt something shift in her chest. "What's your call sign, Ensign?" "I don't have one yet, ma'am." Sierra glanced at Garrett, who nodded with understanding. "Tell you what," Sierra said. "You get through qualification, prove you've got what it takes, and I'll personally recommend you to this crew. We could use someone who knows what it's like to fight for their place, who understands that being underestimated can be an advantage if you refuse to quit. Colin's face lit up with hope and determination. I won't let you down, ma'am. I know you won't, Sierra said, because you've already proven the most important thing: you showed up. Now go show them what you can do. The ensign saluted sharply and strode away with new purpose, and Sierra watched her go with something like pride. You're going to be a good mentor, Garrett observed. Had a good example, Sierra replied. The ensign disappeared toward the training building, and Garrett checked his watch. I should let you get back to work. Yes, sir. Sierra extended her hand. Thank you for all of it. Garrett shook her hand firmly. Watching you become this, that's all the thanks I need. He walked away toward the parking lot, and Sierra turned back to her Apache. The crew was already prepping for the afternoon training flight. Hollis waved from the crew compartment. Bowen was checking navigation charts in the cockpit. This was where she belonged, not in the past. Here. Sierra climbed the ladder, settled into the pilot's seat, and reached for the controls. Through the canopy, she could see the Pacific stretching to the horizon, endless and indifferent. She had been invisible once. They had called her Ghost. But ghosts don't fly $64 million weapon systems. Ghosts don't save lives. Ghosts don't earn the Navy Cross. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She never had been. She was Nighthawk, and she had work to do.